Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast.
Welcome to the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. I'm Tom Ricks, and there's enough stuff going on that I felt the need to comment on some of it. And I think that I nearly made this a humorous episode because of just how stupid some of what I'm seeing is. But I think it's also serious enough that I didn't, make funny voices and make a soundtrack of mocking music like I did for Thank You Twitter support. Because at the end of the day, that was just so stupid that I had to just joke about it. And I want to joke about this, but it's actually really serious. And specifically speaking, I think the top of my list of things that I want to talk about is um, Putin is a cartoon character, right? He's not just the arch villain of the Disney Christmas special where all the villains come together and come up with a plot to steal Christmas from the Disney characters, right? Because you've got Z and Baldero and Trump, who is definitely the comic relief of the comic relief characters, and Hungary, and all of these people working in sync to be absolute assholes. But the thing that finally was the tip of the ice, the tipping point for me was this article that came out about a new fighter that Russia has created called the Checkmate fighter. And I mean, first of all, let's just think about that name, right? It's not like, the Wildcat or the Falcon or the F-13 or whatever. It's the Checkmate, right? And specifically speaking, I finally realized that Putin is not just a cartoon character, he has a very identifiable cartoon character, and that cartoon character is Flintheart Glomgold from Ducktales. So, for those of you who have not seen the recent remake of Ducktales on Disney Plus, I can't recommend it enough. It's fun and it's fantastic and it's very well written. But the current incarnation of this character is a character who ran into Scrooge McDuck. And long story short, he's lived a very long life due to an enchantment. And he runs into Flintheart Glomgold as a child and doesn't tip him enough for a shoe shine. And so this tragic and yet really basically stupid character dedicates his entire life and reinvents his persona. His original name is apparently Duke Baloney, and reinvents his entire persona to be the anti-Scrooge, right? He's South African, but he changes his accent to Scottish. He makes his life mission to be the richest duck in the world. He literally comes up with constant, elaborate, just stupid schemes. And he in the one of the more fun episodes, they changed the opening credits to have a version with Glomgold, who, by the way, is also voiced by David Tennant, which is fantastic. He just speaks in a rougher, deeper voice. And they, he basically is so cheap that he literally just copies and pastes his face over the other characters. And, he takes pride in these elaborate schemes that basically never, ever, ever work. Now, Putin is obviously far more successful than this cartoon character is, but nevertheless, the reason I'm making the parallel is because the Checkmate fighter, on some other articles that I read, besides the alarmist ones from supposedly reliable news sources like Newsweek, I'm reading some other articles that say, okay, well, this fighter is, theoretically comparable in many ways to the F-35, is certainly for Russia's tech level. Russia may have some societal problems, but gone are the days where Russia can go toe to toe with the United States. That's much more China, and I'm not going to go into China too much in this episode. But I will say that China is an actual threat, an actual rival in technology and economic power to the United States. And there's every reason to believe that, assuming China doesn't destroy itself with its own stupidity, they will become the largest economy in the world sometime maybe within the next 10 or 20 years. And anyway, back to this Checkmate fighter. So it turns out that while it does have the capacity as a prototype to match the F-35, and let's all remember, by the way, that the F-35 is its own problem. We have spent so much money on this fighter that it's not even funny. It's almost like $10 million a fighter at this point. It doesn't work sometimes it hasn't worked in the rain. Sometimes it gets shut down with lightning. So the F-35 has problems, like just tons and tons of problems. But nevertheless, in large part because of the absolute brilliantly and corrupt sales tactics of the U.S. military industrial complex, we've sold not just this fighter, but versions of this fighter to dozens of countries around the world. And by the time we're done with it, it will be pretty advanced, right? So the thing that most people don't realize about defense contracts is that while they are initially crap, they're iterative, so they replace them a bit at a time, over and over again. And so by the time they're done, by the time the F-35 is at its peak, it will probably work pretty well. It will have still been a colossal boondoggle and a waste of money, mainly because the entire program is literally designed to spread out the supply chain to as many countries and as many congressional districts as possible to make it literally unstoppable, which frankly should be illegal in my opinion. But as many problems as the F-35 has, it's approaching working. It's approaching the point where if I see a news article or a watch CNN on a live military conflict, I'm no longer worried about our fighter pilots literally dying by getting into this thing and there's a rainstorm, and it might suddenly disable the fighter. The Checkmate, on the other hand, and part of the reason I went into all that about the F-35 is you have to understand that part of what makes the F-35 works is the deals that we've made with other countries, right? Well, to make a comparable F-35, Russia is going to have to come up with deals with other countries, right? In other words, it's just like the International Space Station. It is very difficult to fund and mass produce something as complicated as the F-35 or its Russian equivalent of the Checkmate fighter without other countries participating. Well, it turns out that Russia's customers for this thing equals exactly zero. I mean, China's not going to buy it. China has its own fighter program. The EU isn't going to buy it, right? So some of the countries I'm seeing on here are India, Argentina. I can't remember any of the other large countries, but suffice to say that when Argentina and India are your largest potential customers, you've got problems. The thing about India is India has its own fierce domestic pride in military matters. Their air force has had some real problems, but there is strong motivation within India to procure its own version, and I can see why Russia strongly believes that they don't want to buy the F-35 because India, while it's aligning itself in some ways more and more with the United States against China, India has always wanted to and will continue to want to go its own way. In fact, an argument could be made that if India manages to preserve its democracy in spite of Modi, the 21st century may in fact be the Indian century instead of the Chinese century, because even though China is slated to become a first world country and an economic superpower much sooner than India, the thing that people forget about democracy is the reason democratic countries tend to be wealthier is because of the transition of power, right? Z is, in his 50s and is, in his able to more or less run the country, just again, despite the fact that China is shooting itself in the foot by doing a lot of really stupid things. But, you know, when he goes, there's going to be a real problem in China because Z is a genuine strongman, and he's even more of a strongman than Putin. Putin, who I've literally in this episode compared to a cartoon character, at least has a successor. Like he has honored the constitution of Russia enough to step down as president and become prime minister and hand power over to another guy for 2 terms and then hand it back. Um, and he's had the Constitution updated multiple times, and eventually decided that he could just basically be president for life. But there is a clear successor to Putin. The same argument cannot be made for Xi. The last time they had a leader in China as strong as Xi, it was Mao. And after Mao, there was a civil war, and a whole lot of damage was done. And civil wars are messy and costly. And it only takes one for India to potentially catch up. Now, India has its own problems. For example, recently in India, they decided to just have the tax office just raid a newspaper because it was critical of the government. The official explanation was taxes, but everybody understands it was because they criticized Modi on COVID, right? So India is still nominally a democracy, but it's rapidly heading in the direction of Turkey or Hungary or Poland. But back to Putin, look, here's the thing about the checkmate, right? Even assuming India buys this thing, India plus Russia is probably not going to be enough to make this thing viable. So what Russia did is to both maintain and their technological edge. They built this checkmate fighter to match the F-35, but they don't have the economic or international clout to make it work. Plus, let's all remember that basically Russia has literally become um, House Slytherin, right? I mean, they are Cobra. They are the bad guys. Like, they are literally mustache twirling villains who are the home of dark mercenaries. They're one of the only countries in the world to recently literally invade another country, take a chunk of that country for their own, and say, fuck you to the rest of the world, and thumb their nose at Europe, which basically dithered and basically did nothing except sanction a few people. And same thing with the United States. Russia is much better off now than they ever were during the Cold War. You can still go to Russia on a passport. You can still, business from the West does it at their own risk, but basically Google and Twitter and a lot of American companies have employees in Russia and earn a lot of money there. And while Russia might still be closing itself off bit by bit, more or less, Russia is at least as connected to the world as most of the countries in Africa or most of the countries in South America. Right? It might have a different way of doing things, but they haven't really paid a price for literally invading another country and taking a chunk of its territory. But they have at the same time, right? So, and what I mean by that is Russia is by and large not considered a good actor by anybody, right? In other words, Russia is not trusted by anybody except maybe a lot of countries in Eastern Europe that have long been in the sphere of influence of Russia, Serbia in particular. But the reason I'm doing this episode at all, the reason I'm comparing Putin to Flintheart Glomgold, is that Putin is so desperate to go, nuh-uh, to the United States like some kind of 5-year-old child, that he's competent enough to have mercenaries and a mafia kleptocracy and one of the most sophisticated intelligence agencies in the world, and he literally invented the modern concept of hybrid warfare and little green men that give them plausible deniability to cause shit to stir up shit and cause problems all over the world. There's one country in the world right now that is helping out the extremely unpopular and evil coup in Myanmar, and that is Russia. And Russia can get away with this shit. But the thing is that the other thing that Russia has done that's just unbelievably successful is every conservative movement in the world, right? I've already gone over this in other podcasts. Every country in the world has a conservative element. Like, even if you're Cuba and you're communist, right? There's an element that's reactionary and is hardcore communist and is against any form of change, and then there's the more liberal version that wants to open up trade and let people have free speech and so on and so forth. Even in Iran, right? Iran is a democratic theocracy, but in Iran there's the hardliners and the moderates. The hardliners are conservative and want things to be the way they've always been and go back to traditional ancient values. And then there's the more moderates that want to have trade with the West and have values like free speech. And so, almost universally, I'm sure there's an example of a reactionary faction somewhere in the world that isn't in alignment with Russia, but everyone I know about, with the possible exception of the Baltic states, I'd be willing to bet that the reactionary faction in those is not pro-Russia. But in Europe, especially Western Europe, every single radical or reactionary party is friendly with Putin. In the United States, the Republicans think that Putin is the best thing since sliced bread. In Brazil, they think that Putin is awesome. In Hungary and in Poland, same thing. In India, the BJP is very friendly with Russia. And the thing that I've noticed is that thanks to the internet, these factions have begun to learn from each other. Right? They learned from the 1984 change history as it's always been tactics invented by Karl Rove for George W. Bush, which I believe he learned from the Mormon Church, by the way. And they've learned from the meme generating mob violence on social media that was created by Russia. Now, every one of them does it, and they all share conspiracies and the same alternate reality bullshit to the point that they basically created a shared fake reality that almost every conservative faction in the world believes, the virus is a conspiracy and, Jewish space lasers and, have at it. And the thing that is most striking to me, and again, the reason I'm doing this entire podcast episode is they're cartoons, right? Look, I haven't liked Republicans or the right since the 1994 contract with America, where they literally instigated a witch hunt against Clinton. Part of the way I was raised is to understand that McCarthy was evil and witch hunts are bad. And the instant they started doing what was patently obvious to me as a witch hunt, I started questioning being a Republican, even though I was raised as one and still a member of the LDS Church. But I started having problems with the Republican Party the instant they started that witch hunt against Clinton because he supposedly committed perjury, even though they lie all the time. But at the time, they were still intellectually serious, right? They may not have been good people, they may have lied, but they weren't cartoons, right? George W. Bush was a little bit cartoonish. I mean, they did some, the idea of a month and a half after 9/11 and having a tremendous surge of popularity. George W. Bush immediately after 9/11 had something like 90% approval from the American public. And the idea that you're stupid enough to take that immense gift of power and surge of goodwill and literally 6 weeks after 9/11 start making plans to invade Iraq is kind of stupid. It is cartoonish, but it's not like Looney Tunish, right? It's not House Slytherin. It's not Cobra from GI Joe. That's Putin. And the reason I'm comparing Putin to Flintheart Glomgold is because Flintheart Glomgold is not just evil, right? And he's not just stupid. He is literally defined his entire life around doing everything in his power to show up Scrooge McDuck. And Putin has literally dedicated his entire fucking life to winning the Cold War again and again and again, right? To just fucking America and fucking democracy as much as he can. He will do things that are against the long-term interests of Russia, except for making sure that Russia is militarily strong. Like, I'm not a fan of Russia's hypersonic missile, but from Russia's perspective, I absolutely understand why they're doing it. Russia is not a fan of the superiority of American defense technology or military technology or space technology, and we're getting to the point where we can literally shoot down an ICBM. We've been told that's impossible, but now, especially thanks to advancements in SpaceX and particle accelerators and lasers and all the amazing tech we have here in the 21st century, you can shoot down an ICBM. There are people that disagree with that, but those are mainly people like Code Pink who are against any form of military defense technology because they believe that we should be wide open to nukes because, mutually assured destruction and all that is insanely stupid stuff. By the way, Code Pink has been completely co-opted by Russia, and the supposed peace activists now live in the alternate reality of the American Green Party and anti-vaxxers and all that crap. They used to be the forefront of the fight against George W. Bush, and now Code Pink has basically also become cartoon characters. But I digress. My point being that as effective as Putin has been at being evil, which to be fair, he's far more effective than cartoon villains. He's more effective than Cobra because Cobra doesn't lose. And he's more effective than House Slytherin, which, so far as I know, except for Voldemort, never really did anything successfully. They're also cartoon characters. They're basically like they exist to be evil, and because you need an evil house. Even though there's some good Slytherin and blah 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 blah, but J.K. Rowling's a transphobe, so who cares about the complex political nuances or lack thereof in Harry Potter. By the way, for those not familiar, one of my best podcast episodes was Harry Potter and the Prisoner of J.K. Rowling. Feel free to look that up. But my point being that all the main reason that cartoon villains are not successful is because American and other scriptwriters feel that children should not be taught that evil can triumph. But in the real world, evil can and does sometimes triumph. And, Flintheart Glomgold / Putin is evil and is a cartoon, but there's not some scriptwriter in our reality that says, no, Putin, at the end of this episode, America will not choose to elect Trump because, G.I. Joe stopped the evil interference of the election and the big lie was exposed because we printed something in the newspaper and suddenly all of the good patriotic Americans suddenly realized that this is a lie. No, it doesn't. The reality doesn't work that way, right? In fact, if anything, any lesson that's ever learned by the cartoon Republicans is immediately forgotten at the start of the next episode. If anything involves scripting, if this reality is a simulation, it's that the cartoons that are conservatives in every country in the world that have all aligned themselves to the cartoonishness of Putin learn nothing and have no values except the acquisition of power. This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. Buy my book, Have Name Will Travel, at Amazon and other markets. RedAnvilCreative.com contains all our podcasts. Copyright 2021.
To fight the forces of evil!